The question of free will is one of the deepest and most mysterious areas of human activity and of Torah thinking, and it is probably also the most important. So let's try to put our heads into this subject and see if we can think our way through some of the complexity of the subject. Give me a chance to build a picture of this subject from a Torah perspective, at least certain aspects of it. And then if you have any questions, if I'm able to, I'll do my best to answer. Perhaps the logical way to do this is as follows. We can divide free will, the subject of free will, into two areas. The more practical area, in other words, what is our view, what is the Torah view, or the classical sources, what is their view of how free will looks if you dissect the anatomy of the subject. And then there's a much deeper mystical aspect to the subject which we try to discuss as well if we can. First of all, just by way of introduction, we have many sources that indicate that free will is the basis of everything. For example, in Mesilas Yesharim, a classical work of Jewish character building or personality development, he says that you are created for three reasons. In other words, the purpose of life. What's the Jewish expression of the purpose of life? So you're here for three reasons, for three things. One is la'avod, which means to serve. One is la'asos mitzvahs, to perform the mitzvot. And third is la'amod b'nisayon, to stand strong in ordeals. And standing strong in an ordeal really means to use your free will correctly. Because our definition of all ordeal is really the battle between the higher and the lower self. And it's there that free will is pitched. It's in that battle between the higher and the lower self that we understand that free will operates. And therefore at least 1/3 of the purpose of being alive, and if you really think it through, you'll see that all three of those really boil down to the same thing. At least 1/3 of the Jewish definition of the purpose of being alive is to exercise free will correctly. So let's see if we can do this. Again, the mystical conception here is that free will is uniquely human, that the only 2 points of freedom, if you like, in the whole system and beyond are really Hashem's, the creator's, and ours. That means there's nothing else in the universe that ever does what it's not supposed to do. Not a cockroach, and not an atom, and not a molecule, and not a planet. Nothing other than a human being ever moves out of line. Now, we're uniquely positioned at that point where we can do what we should do and do the opposite. Technically speaking, angels also have free will. Malachim also have free will. And if there's time, perhaps we can talk about it. But in real practical terms, we are the place where free will is fully expressed. So let's try to categorize the subject. First of all, practically, on a more practical level. So we would say that free will is severely limited. Your free will is extremely limited. If you like, on a horizontal plane, we would say that your free will is limited only to that area that we call moral. That's an important axiom in Jewish thinking. That means most areas of one's life are really not amenable to free will at all. Right? For example, health. Right? You can do all the right health things and turn out to be disastrously ill. It happens all the time. Wealth, for example. The general trend of Jewish thinking is that how wealthy you will be, certainly the ceiling of how much you can earn in a year, is largely predetermined. Right? It's not amenable to your free will. You can make all the right moves in the wealth department and live in abject poverty. And you can be a complete idiot and be fabulously wealthy. In fact, I know quite a few people in that category. There's no relationship there's no bonded relationship between the two. And many other things. Whom you marry, for example. Whom you marry. Yeah, I mean, who's presented to you as a marriage opportunity, right? A young man cannot, for example, explore a relationship with every woman on earth, even though this generation appears seriously to be trying. But there is a limitation to the opportunities that are presented. And therefore, our classical teaching is that the free will is expressed specifically in that zone where right and wrong operate, where there's a higher self, the self that is more identified with conscience and refinement and knowing what's right, pitched in battle with a lower, more animal, sensuous, earthy self. It's there, it's in that zone of life that free will operates. Technical choices like which pair of socks you're going to put on today and which flavor dessert you'll eat, that's really not in the Torah discussion of free will. Animals make those decisions too. An animal also chooses between technical options. We're not talking about that. We're talking here about those things that operate in the moral zone. Right? That's the first issue. Now the second, which is much more subtle, much more difficult to understand, is that free will is also limited on the vertical scale. And this is probably the most classic of all of Rav Dessler's teachings, for example. This is probably certainly one of the most classical themes that he develops. And it's a uniquely clear way of expressing this idea for our generation. And it's worth a lot of thought. What he explains is that we have freedom only at a particular level on a vertical scale, if you care to make a picture of it. In other words, there are things below your level of free will that in practical terms you're not really free there. That means they are so far beneath you that you always do them right, not because you've overcome those, not because you battle in those areas, but because you're too refined to do those things. And therefore you can't really be said to be winning any battle there. In other words, it's habitual or it's unthinking that you get those things right. And then there are things beyond your level of free will that you always get wrong, and you cannot strictly be said to be failing in that area, because you never reached that level yet. Right? This is the classical idea that he calls Nekudas HaBechira, the point of free will. And let's see if we can focus on this, because it answers many difficulties, particularly there's a trend in the secular world. I'm sure some of you are studying psychology. Any psychology students here? Law students? By doing law? In the fields of psychology and law and criminology and sociology, there's a definite trend towards the position in which it is held that there's no free will at all. Right? There's a minimizing of true freedom. There are a lot of studies that are being published now in fields like criminology, where they take a population, for example, a population of violent criminals, and they attempt to show that they have genetic or chemical markers that differ statistically from the rest of the population. Are you familiar with this? The suggestion being that to the extent that those biological or so-called hardwired factors are present, to that extent responsibility or freedom is diminished. That's a serious problem, this. Perhaps let me give you an example to make it even more sharp. How do we approach situations where there is a technical coercive factor? Let's assume it would be demonstrated tomorrow that certain behavior patterns are linked to certain genetic or biochemical factors. Right? What would happen to free will? I'll give you an example. I have a friend who's a psychiatrist. So some time ago he came to me to discuss a patient with whom he's dealing. It's a young girl, 21 years old, from a Jewish family. As it happens, from a very wealthy family. And this girl has a particular psychoneurotic problem. She steals sweets in the supermarket. Okay? She has a tremendous pleasure that she gets when she takes sweets in the supermarket and puts them in her pocket, and she finds it tremendously difficult to resist that temptation. She has all the sweets she could possibly eat at home, and she can afford as much as she wants. But she has a tremendous pleasure. That's a well-recognized psychological behavior pattern. The problem is that she's now in court for the 10th time. And the judge has asked my friend to testify about whether she's sane or not. And he finds himself in a very difficult dilemma. Because if he testifies that she's insane, which means legally what they call psychotically detached from reality, she will be sent off for psychiatric analysis and help. But if he tells the judge that she's sane, she'll probably be jailed. And jail may well kill her. And he finds himself unable to tell the judge that she's insane. Because by no stretch of the imagination is this girl insane. She's not detached from reality. She knows what she's doing. She knows it's wrong. She knows it's morally reprehensible. She's trying to control it, but she has difficulty controlling it. What do we say Jewishly to that situation? What if it could be demonstrated? Let's say tomorrow they do a study and find that this young girl has a genetic and biochemical marker that maps perfectly to kleptomania. What would we say about her free will? Would we exempt her entirely? Let me give you another example. A few years ago, in New York City, a young girl was jogging through the park, through Central Park, when some young men attacked her. They almost killed her. They brutalized her terribly. They almost killed her. They were caught sometime later, and they said they did it for fun. They did it for fun. Now, there's nothing probably unusual about that in most big, large cities today. But what was unusual about it is that when the case came to court in New York State, the defense team raised a novel defense. They said that these young men should be acquitted because they grew up in very disadvantaged circumstances. In fact, they came from the Harlem ghetto, and the defense counsel argued that these young men had such abysmally disadvantaged backgrounds. They were beaten as children, abandoned, they had no role models, they grew up in abject poverty with no education. They had such distressing and such negative inputs in their youth that the behavior is an outcome of their upbringing. In fact, without going into detail, the real debate in the courtroom was the defense team tried to invalidate the jury. They said that you members of the jury are not able to judge these people because you've got nothing in common with them. You have a middle-class, refined background, and therefore you cannot relate to these people's ordeal. That's a fascinating issue. But without getting into the technicalities, how do we deal with that? You see, if you say that this behavior, the reason that they attacked this young girl, is a function of their upbringing, in other words, you say you express it as a mechanical system. You say that the outputs of the behavior are the result of the inputs of the upbringing. Like in any mechanical system or lower biological system. Then you can forget about justice. You can certainly forget about punitive justice. Because theoretically, then all our activities, all our outputs could well be results of the inputs. And there's a trend in modern psychology that teaches that. That says that all your activity, all your functional output is nothing other than the result of all the inputs. If I knew all your genetics and all your biochemistry and all your socializing influences and all the events that happen to you when you're 2 and 3 and 4, I would know exactly how you respond to every situation. There's a trend of thought like that. Quantum mechanics has changed it, and there are those who argue that there's no determinacy, but in psychological terms, there is such a thought process. On the other hand, if you say that they're accountable for their action, that they had free will, whether to attack this girl or not, and you ignore their disadvantaged background, you're a fool. Because any idiot can see that that behavior is somehow connected to the background, right? I'm sure none of you sitting in this room today spend your afternoons looking for girls jogging through the park to beat up and torment with lead pipes. And I mean, I don't know you personally, but I presume if you're spending Tuesday night listening to a Torah lecture, probably that's not what you do for fun. I mean, I sincerely hope that that's the case. Why not? Because you weren't brought up like that. You were brought up in decent circumstances with refined inputs, and that's why you wouldn't do that. You'd be sickened at the thought. You wouldn't consider that pleasure. So Jewishly, we have a problem here. Is the result, is their behavior a result of the background, or is it independent of the background? Either way you look, you have a problem. So let's try and clarify this from a Jewish point of view. There's nothing more basic than this subject. Right? Stay with me carefully. Let's take in the subject together, and if something bothers you, we'll try to speak it through, try to speak it out. Our teaching is that the zone of operation of your free will may not be your fault. That's what's called Nekudas HaBechira. That's called the point of free will. An individual brought up in certain circumstances with certain objective phenomena, whether they're psychological inputs or whether they're biochemical or genetic or physical, those things may in fact not be amenable to free will. And they set the area where your free will operates. Right? Take an individual who's brought up in very disadvantaged circumstances, brought up in the gutter, and all this person does is mug little old ladies and take their money. What is the range of that person's free will? His range of free will is perhaps that the next time he attacks a little old lady, instead of killing her, he'll only crack her skull. And it could be that for him, that's a tremendous moral elevation. It could be an amazing achievement for such an individual. On the other hand, somebody on a very refined level, whose Nekudas HaBechira is very high, let's say some righteous individual who's been working on himself for many years, and he's studied Torah for years, and he's working on making sure that every word that he says is absolutely pure. He's now working on his thoughts, let's say. So the zone of operation of his free will is somewhere up there. You could never judge him at the lower level. When this man is walking towards the yeshiva, let's say, to give a lecture in Torah, and he's occupied totally with the level of purity that he's trying to generate. And the little old lady walks past with her purse, and there's half a brick lying on the pavement next to her. And he resists the temptation to pick it up and crack her skull. You think he's going to get any spiritual reward for that? When I go to the next world and Hashem says to me, Tatz, what did you achieve on earth? And I say, I never stole any sweets in the supermarket. You think he's going to say, Yeshua, very impressive. He's not going to say that, because that's not my problem. I got my own problems, I can assure you. But as it happens, stealing sweets in the supermarket is not one of them. Because the point of my Nekudas HaBechira, that's not where it is. But for some individual, for this girl who has that problem, That is where her free will operates. Is it her fault that the point of her free will is set in the issue of being tempted by taking? Maybe not. Maybe not. It is totally conceivable that the reason she grapples with that area is biochemical, or behavioral, or functional, or because of a family, all of the above, none of the. It's all conceivable. We would have no change in our thinking on this point if tomorrow they demonstrated that there's a biological component. All we would say is that that component determines where the point of free will is. Are you with me? But what you do at that point of free will, that's entirely up to you. If the range of your free will is whether you mug your next victim in a more cruel or less cruel fashion, it could be that those options are not your fault. But what you do, which of those options you take, is entirely yours, and that's where you. These young men who beat that girl up in the park, it could well be that it's not their fault that they were tempted, as their idea of fun, to torment and almost kill a young girl. Whose fault is that? The United States government, poverty, the inner city, the ghetto, grandparents, all of those things are relevant. But when they do that action, they're accountable. Because the issue they're grappling with is to give in to that or not to give in to that. The moral sensibility that they have to know that they wouldn't enjoy being beaten up with a lead pipe and having every bone in their body broken, that they know. And therefore what they're grappling with is at that point of freedom whether to do it or not. And you're only battling at the point where your freedom is pitched. Is this point clear? Rav Dessler, in an unforgettable analogy, he says that you are locked in battle, your higher self is locked in battle with your lower self like two countries at war. The entirety of the countries are at war. But the pain and conflict is only felt on the front line. Yeah, the front line is the point of freedom. Your entire higher self is locked in battle with your entire lower self. It's an ongoing, lifelong war. But the pain and conflict is felt only where the fighting is going on. And there may be advances or retreats. But you operate only at that point. And it's like that, if you need an analogy, I don't know what you do here in Manchester, but let's say you play tennis. You play some kind of sport here? You play tennis. So you play tennis against people who are more or less of the strength of your game. Right? If you play the people in your club and you get better, you have to play the best people in the club. If you can beat them, you have to go and play the other club champions. If you beat them, you have to play the national champions. If you beat them, you become an international. Your battle is meaningfully pitched only at a place where the forces are meaningfully. If you walked out in the tennis court and played against a 3-year-old who'd never held a racket before, you wouldn't come home full of pride and say that you won the match. Right? You didn't win the match. On the other hand, if you played the world champion and during the entire match you never saw the ball once, you wouldn't come home and say you lost. You didn't lose. You didn't play. Right? You can only be said to be playing and battling at a level that is where there's an exertion. And therefore, our resolution of this issue is that the point of free will, in fact, may have nothing to do with freedom. It may have nothing to do with freedom. It may be set because, and in different areas of life, incidentally, there may be differential levels. This young lady who has a problem with stealing sweets in the supermarket may have no problem in other areas that I may be grappling mightily with. Because she has an issue there. And there are many other complexities, and we don't have time this evening to go into all of them. There's a gray zone around the level of free will. For example, what falls beyond entirely your level of free will? So there you have to be what we call have no dice. No dice means entirely out of the area of freedom. For example, a child. A child is not technically liable. Or a person who is genuinely psychotically detached. And of course around that zone there are very difficult issues. There's a gray zone that requires judgment too. For example, for non-Jews, according to Torah law, what age is a non-Jew responsible? Do you know? At what age is a Jew responsible for his actions? Bar mitzvah, right? 12 for a girl, 13 for a boy. At what age is a non-Jew accountable for his actions according to Torah thinking? When he's old enough. When he's old enough. Bar mitzvah is a mystical, it's a shir, it's halacham lo yishmisina. But for a non-Jew, and that raises tremendous problems. Here in England, some time ago, some children killed a baby. Right? The court had a very difficult time deciding whether those children were old enough to take accountability or not. It's a very difficult issue. There are difficult issues. I heard from Rav Zilberstein in Bnei Brak not so long ago. He told us about a young man with Down syndrome. A young fellow with Down syndrome. He came from Bnei Brak to see Rav Elyashiv in Yerushalayim because his father wouldn't let him have a bar mitzvah. So he walked into Rav Elyashiv and he said, I want to have a bar mitzvah, my father won't let me. He says, I'm not allowed and it's invalid, I can't read the Torah for that. So Rabbi Yashiv said to him, how did you get here? So he said, I took a 27 bus in Bnei Brak and I went to the Tachana Merkazit, the main bus station, and I took a number 1 bus to Yerushalayim, and from there I took a 33 bus. And Rabbi Yashiv said, go back and tell your father you can have a bar mitzvah. He said, if you can manage that, you have a bar mitzvah. Would he allow him to be a witness in a Jewish court of law? Probably not. But there's a gray zone which requires judgment. There's no question about that. But the principle remains true that free will is pitched at a level, so far so good. And therefore, if you in your psychology lectures, you have a debate about the subject, they are right and they are wrong. They're entirely right that the background issues and the genetics and the chemistry and all those influences, they're 100% right that they're relevant. But they do not coerce the decision. All they do is set where the battle will be pitched. What you decide in the zone where the battle is pitched is entirely up to you. And it's got nothing to do with any background issues. At that point, you're entirely free. So far, so good? Furthermore, that point of free will has consequences for all its ripple effects. Right? For example, let's say you make a free will decision. You take responsibility and you do something. There's credit in the spiritual world. That means there's an elevation. There's a spiritual elevation. We could call it reward, let's say, for the mitzvah. I'm not talking about reward for the intrinsic mitzvah. Let's just stop here for a moment. We have a notion that for every mitzvah, for every positive action, and for every avera, every transgression, there are 2 sets of reward and 2 sets of punishment. Are you familiar with this idea? For every mitzvah, there are 2 concepts of reward. One is for the intrinsic function of the mitzvah, right? Mitzvahs are not in English what you call whimsical. They're not simply opportunities to obey. When you eat matzah on Pesach, you're not only rewarded for obeying a commandment. There's also something objective that happens in the cosmic world, in all the worlds, because you eat matzah. There's a reward or an objective output of the mitzvah itself, and there's also a reward or an elevation for the having obeyed. The one is in proportion to the effort, and the one has nothing to do with the effort. The intrinsic value of the mitzvah we have no way of judging. On the contrary, it's hidden from us entirely. We have no way of knowing which mitzvahs have which types of reward. But the second category, which is the reward for the effort you make, that is entirely in proportion to the effort. In the free will discussion, we're only talking about the free will, effort, and reward and consequences. Okay, we're not talking about the other set this evening. Every time you do an avera, every time you do a transgression, there's intrinsic damage. If you eat unkosher food, for example. Let's say you eat unkosher food. There are 2 kinds of damage. There's objective spiritual damage, that there's a contamination or desensitization of the heart. And that's got nothing to do with how difficult it was or wasn't to resist. And then there's damage from having lost the battle with your own self. And that damage is in proportion to the difficulty. Incidentally, this is why it pays to be more strict where appropriate. Right? Because if you eat something unkosher, even if entirely unintentional, it still harms you. Because there's intrinsic harm. Yeah? Let's say, for example, it's completely unintentional. You go into some restaurant, and you want to know if it's kosher, so you check the sign on the wall, and you go and look at the mashgiach, and you check the length of his beard, and the length of his wife's beard, and you really do it thoroughly, until you're totally convinced by all standards the food's kosher, and it happens to be unkosher that day by some accident. Do you know the outcome of that? You get harmed, you get damaged. You get no damage for having transgressed anything in your free will department. You didn't do that. But there's objective intrinsic harm if there's a shame isser. In other words, if there's a halachic prohibition, if there's a halachic status that's negative that's attached to that food. And conversely, if you lose it one day and you go into a non-kosher place, it'll never happen with any of the present company, but assume that you did that, and you decide to have something really disastrously unkosher, and it so happens they served you glut kosher food. So happens. You still get harmed, you know that? You don't get harmed by the food because there's nothing wrong with the food. But you get harmed by the effort, by the losing of the battle with the self. Are we clear about that? In tonight's discussion, we're not talking about the mystical effect of the mitzvahs. We're only talking about the free will effort. And for that, there's consequences that go on and on forever. Let's say you make a free will decision and you help someone. And because of that, you change their life. And because of that, there are many consequences that ripple on through history. You take credit for the whole chain of events. Because you're the ultimate cause. The only place you disconnect from the effects is when a new free will decision is made. And conversely, if you do something negative and you harm someone, and because of that they harm someone else, not through their free will, for example, you bring up a child. Bring up a child in a negative fashion. And that child lives a negative life, and that has you take accountability for the whole string of events. Do you know how far this goes? You might just make a comment. Just say, father's talking on the telephone, little 5-year-olds under the table. Father says to his friend on the phone, well, look, it's not strictly true, but tell him it's okay. Little child hears a statement that the father's standards of truth are a little lower. And he grows up with a different value of truth. And he runs his life that way. Do you know that all the consequences of negativity all trace themselves back to the accountability of that one statement that that father made? Because that's where, you know, I mean, Rav Dessler also explains, I mean, once we're frightening ourselves, we might as well do it thoroughly. So let's terrify ourselves, you know, utterly. You know that on Rosh Hashanah it says that the books of the living and the dead are opened. You know that. The living and the dead are judged. And the Kabbalists ask an interesting question. Why are the dead judged on Rosh Hashanah? By definition, a person who's been dead for a year cannot be any different than they were the year before. Right? Yeah, if time is passing by, and this person's life ends here, let's say, the next year they're judged in the spiritual world, whatever that means. The next year they're judged again. How could they be different here than they were a year before? By definition, not being in the world means you cannot go up or down. You have no tools with which to operate. You coast with the momentum that was built up before. So what sense does it make to judge souls every year? You hear the question. Yeah, anyone out there? There's a fascinating question, and there are a number of answers. The Kabbalists give fascinating answers. But one answer that's relevant to tonight's discussion is, and it's an amazing thing, do you know why someone's judged when they're in another world at this point, and a year later they're judged again, and they're a different person? Do you know why? Because during this year, while they weren't alive, many events transpired on earth that were the results of something they did back when they were alive. Let's say 500 years ago someone died. And they brought a child into the world and they taught that child certain spiritual values. And the child had children and taught the same values. And 500 years later, let's say there are 1,000 people alive who descended from that one child, living those values. All the credit of all of those actions accrues to the individual who... That's why in Judaism, when we do things for parents or grandparents who are no longer alive, we're not being sentimental. There's nothing sentimental in Jewish life. We mean it in a tangible fashion. Because inasmuch as you live positively, because that person gave you those values, so to that extent the credit is genuinely, that's what, and of course the debit too. You can't claim credit for something you were brought up doing. You have to move beyond that. If you want to claim credit in the free will arena, you have to make your own new decision. And some life events are clear. I mean, I'll share with you an incident. To me, illustrates it very dramatically. You know, I know a man who is, I know him personally. It's not a second-hand story. He happens to be a diamond dealer in New York. I met him in South Africa when he came to buy diamonds. This particular individual, his mother was pregnant in the Warsaw ghetto, right, just before it was destroyed. And she needed to see a doctor. So she managed to escape from the ghetto, and she went to see a lady doctor, and a Christian Catholic lady doctor from the old Polish aristocracy in Warsaw City. And after the doctor treated this Jewish woman, as she was about to leave the office, this doctor said to her, look, if you go back into the ghetto, you know what will happen to you? So she said, yes, I know. So she said, look, come and stay with me, I'll take care of you. So the woman said, I can't leave my husband. So she said, bring your husband as well. So she said, I can't leave my family. So she said, bring your family as well. So the Jewish woman went back into the ghetto, and she said to her husband that this Christian lady is offered to save our lives. So the husband said, I can't leave my family. So they took his family as well. And they arrived at this Christian lady's house with 13 people. She put them up in her attic for 22 months, including a period during which the Gestapo occupied the house. And for 22 months she fed them, and with her own hands carried away all their waste. They never left the attic for 22 months. At the end of that time, she had an opportunity to get them out, and she managed to get them out, and they crossed the border, and all 13 of those people survived, and they made it to New York. Right? A few years ago in New York City, there was a wedding of one of the grandchildren of one of those 13 people. And at that wedding in New York were 200 people present, descended from the 13 people, 200 people at one time and place, descended from the 13 people that this lady had saved, and they went back to Poland and they found her and they brought her to be present to see that. Very old lady, they brought her to be present. She sat at that Hashanah in New York to see 200 people dancing at a wedding who were descendants. And during the festivities, somebody went up to her and they said to her, why did you do it? Why did you risk your life to save Jews? And she said, because she drew herself up to a full, frail height, and she said, because I read Genesis. And there I saw that Abraham negotiated with God. And he said to God, if there are 50 people, will you save the city when Sodom was about to be destroyed? And God said, yes. And if there were 45? And she said, I hope there were enough of us to save Poland. And I was wrong. Now that's something to be envious of. There's an action of free will, an individual made, a human being made. And the consequences are very measurable. They all go back there. The next issue in the technical layout of free will is that your point of free will shifts, okay? That as you make a free will decision and you overcome a lower level, you grow spiritually and then your negativity grows. Because can you see the logic of that? If you grew spiritually, that means you overcame some negativity and you became a bigger person spiritually, more powerful. But your negative drives remained the same. You'd soon outgrow free will. And therefore the balance is maintained that as you grow, as you become a more powerful individual spiritually, your negativity challenges you more. And the battle becomes more difficult. And you have further to fall. But of course it's a more refined battle. You're no longer battling the same crude ordeals. On the contrary, those may become distasteful to you. But nevertheless, the battle is more difficult. And again, the Kabbalists ask an interesting question here. I mean, the philosophers ask a question of why it is like that. And the answer is not that difficult, because otherwise you'd outgrow free will. But the Kabbalists ask a question, how does your negativity become bigger when you're positive? That means if you become a better person, as it were, how come you are more drawn to evil? How does that work? And again, we don't have time to go into the details, but a fascinating principle, and that the reason is because there's only one being inside. You aren't two people. We talk about Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara. But really, the real meaning of that is that there are two different, you know what Yetzer means? It means power of formation. It means how you will form yourself. But you are one being. The question is, there's a spiritual principle that there's nothing in the world that's good or bad. There's only more powerful and less powerful. Good or bad is simply in which direction that power is applied. Are you with me? Electricity, right? One of these sockets here. Let's say, yeah, there's 220 volts there. That's enough to power a few appliances. On the other hand, if you put your fingers in, it's unpleasant. It's unpleasant. You probably survive. It's very unpleasant. But if you take the high tension lines out there, there's 11,000 volts running through those wires. There's enough to power a city. But if you touch those things, you'll be fried instantly. More means more power, and it can do more good or money. Money's not good or bad. A lot of money can do more good in the world or more harm. A charismatic personality, an influential charismatic personality. It's not good or bad. Depends what it's used for. Right? And therefore, when you become a bigger person spiritually, when you train yourself and you overcome, you become a bigger person. You develop more power, more sensitivity, more insight, more self-control. And therefore, you in your entirety are a bigger person. So automatically, your negativity has been... The question is now, at this newfound level of power, in which direction will you apply that power? That's a brief introduction to the technical layout, if you like, of the subject of free will. Let me spend a few minutes looking at the more mystical side. You have energy for that? You know, it's an amazing thing about an English audience. You know, in Israel they throw things at you before you begin. You know, in here they listen politely. You know, but I assume that you are genuinely awake and not just pretending to be. So let me spend a few more minutes and see if we can get into a deeper level. Okay, but this takes effort now because what we set up to now is very basic. What we set up to now is purely logical. It's very basic. I don't really think it's too problematic, but the deeper level is challenging. So stay with me carefully and let's see if we can develop it. And then if you have questions, I'll be happy to stop and try to answer. Let's focus in on the decision itself. In other words, let's say that there's a zone of free will that you occupy. Okay? At present time, your options are being exercised at a particular level. You have a very, very disadvantaged background, your options are low. You have tremendous advantages and refinement, your options are at a very high level. But in that zone, what accounts for the decision? Again, Let's assume that a person grapples with an ordeal, okay? This young girl is grappling with whether she's going to steal the sweets or not. Now, stay with me carefully. If she, let's say, takes the sweets, commits that crime, puts the sweets in her pocket, if there's a psychologist standing next to her, the natural question is, why did she do that? Why? Why did she make that choice? Not why is that the zone where she's grappling. We discussed that already. But in that zone where free will is real, the question why a person does or does not, in Jewish thinking, is an illegitimate question. Okay, please stay with me carefully, because this is not what they'll teach you in modern psychology, and it's problematic. It's an essentially mystical idea. You cannot ask why a free will decision is made. That's an illegitimate question. It is one of those amazing areas in the spiritual world that are understood only in their own terms. The reason that you decide in a free will ordeal is because you decide. Again, if you ask the question, why did the person make that decision? Any answer you give to that question will be a denial of free will. Can you see the logic of that? Let me try and speak it out. Let's assume someone makes an option, they act heroically, yeah? They have an option, they can choose a cowardly option or a heroic option. And you say, why did he choose that? Now be careful, because as soon as you offer an explanation, well, he was brought up like that, his grandmother, his mother, then you are postulating that the free will, that the cause of this action goes back to his mother and grandmother. Then he's not free. Freedom means that I, intrinsically, in and of myself, I choose. It's illegit. Am I making some progress? Are you with me? As soon as you say, let me try and explain better. As soon as you offer an explanation, you can offer an explanation for why I battled in that area. You can even offer an explanation for why I found it that difficult. My upbringing, my genes, my environment. But why at the final knife edge of decision, I was machriya, that means I came down this way or that way? The answer is because I decided. As soon as you offer an explanation there, like my upbringing, my genes, biochemistry, to that extent you're denying free will. You're saying, well, I didn't decide, the output there was a function of the input. Let me try to explain this a little bit better. This is essentially a mystical concept. You make a decision because you decide. You can't put the blame someplace else. Perhaps the way to put this into a structure is as follows. You know, the tool of a free will decision we call das. Right? That is the mechanism, the higher function of inner wisdom or inner knowledge. Again, needs a full explanation. Rav Dessler speaks about it extensively. But what we need to focus on is this. The root of that faculty of knowledge in the mind, in the mystical depiction, is this part of the body here. That means if you draw a line through the center of the... We're not talking about the physical body here. We're talking about the spiritual body. You know, the physical world is only a projection of a spiritual world. In that spiritual world, there's a structure that looks like your body. The truth is, your body looks like that. And in that world, there's a line running through the being. And that line begins where a baby's skull is open. Right? You know, where a child is born with a skull open. You know that. You can feel the brain pulsate in the child. The fontanelle is open. Right? That's a mystical point of connection with the higher world. It's only as you grow that the bony obstruction... In fact, this is why men wear tefillin, you know, according to the Kabbalistic notion. You know, a man wears tefillin in that place of his head, which was once open and has now closed. Do you know what the Kabbalistic name is for tefillin? Bekiyas hamoichin. That means bursting out of the brain. Right? It's a reconnection to a higher world. It's a reopening of that. Of course, women don't wear tefillin because women never lose their connection. That's what it says. Women are always connected. I mean, I personally think that's a misprint. But anyway, that's what it says. The point is that men are the ones who need this reconnection. And they need to burst through that bony obstruction. They need to learn how to do that. This mitzvah of tefillin is that reconnection. But be that as it may, that higher zone, yeah, which is where this is the root of the being. And the technical name that's given to that in our deeper sources is ratzon. Ratzon means desire or will or volition. And you can see the reason for that. Any meaningful action has to begin with a volition. If I wish to give you a gift, let's say, yeah, the nature of that act, of my giving a gift, has many components. But the point of origin is the conception, the flash of desire that I have to give you that gift. That's called the volition or the will. In technical Kabbalistic terms, it's called yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. It's the flashing in of an inspiration where there was none before. From then on in, it becomes mechanical. Again, stay with me carefully. It's very important to understand clearly. When I conceive a desire, let's say to give you a gift, that flashes into my being from some place outside of myself. That's called a yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. And I'm lit up and inspired by that. And immediately it translates itself into physical activity. It becomes brain activity, it becomes nervous impulses, becomes muscular contraction, and eventually the gift is given. But of that whole sequence, there's only one point that's meaningful, and it's that point of origin. Because when it's brain activity and nerve activity and muscle activity, an animal can do that too. A machine can do that too. In fact, animals and machines usually do it better. The only point of meaning in that whole sequence is the flash of inspiration that begins the process. Can you see that? The rest is just what we call a gilui. It's just an expression of what that original point was. And in fact, you know that, because when I give you that gift, what you realize is what that point of intention was. You don't even realize that there were muscles that moved and nerves, and all the technicalities are completely subservient. In fact, they melt away. That point of Ratzon, that point of mysterious something from nothing, which is the point of origin of human activity, of meaningful human activity, right? That is what makes you uniquely human. That's the only difference between you and an animal, or to you and a machine. Of course, science grapples very difficult battle with this, because there's no scientific way of measuring that thing. If you put electrodes into the human being, you can put electrodes into the whole sequence, and you put electrodes into a monkey, and when a monkey does something with a banana, the machines look exactly the same as when you do something with your body. And so the scientific conclusion is you're a monkey. Why? Because there's no scientific tool to measure this thing. So science disregards it. But that is not logical, to disregard that. That's like, one thinker of this generation said that that's like taking a dog and cutting its head off, discarding the head and saying, now let's study what a dog is. That's not bad religion, that's bad science. Okay? It's true that this zone is not amenable to scientific measurement and inquiry, but that's where meaning resides. The only difference, the only meaning of a gift that I give you is that point of origin. Is this point clear? Now that point of origin is the tool of free will. And that point, that tool, that ratzon, you know the word ratzon in Hebrew adds up to the same numerical equivalent as the word makor, which means a source. Actually, Shmo, Hashem's name, has the same numerical value as the ultimate source. But let's study that for a moment. The word for desire, initial desire, ratzon, and the word for a source have the same value. Do you know what that means? The definition of a source is that which has no prior source. You cannot ask for the source of a source, otherwise it wouldn't be a source. Again, I see a lot of blank faces. You can't ask for the point of origin of a flash of inspiration that I have, right? Because if it's a source of a process, the definition of a point of origin is that there's no prior point of origin. Otherwise, that would be the point of origin. Yes? And are we together? Anyone? And therefore, if I make a free will decision, and it's a function of my ratzon, that means I've decided to do it this way or to do it that way. Don't take me back to a previous point. There isn't a previous one. This is who I am. This is where I express myself. This is where I take responsibility. You can't fob that off on some previous mechanism. If you could, this would not be a source. And the notion is that this is where you begin. And it's in this faculty of the mind or of consciousness that free will resides. You make a free will decision because you make that decision. That's who you are. Let me share with you, let me just finish with, perhaps you'll have some questions, but let me finish with, let me try and illustrate this with one particular application. I mean, these are not easy ideas, obviously, but it's, there's very little that's more important with which to grapple. It's very often expressed, erroneously, that free will only operates when the attractions of the options are more or less equal. Have you ever heard that idea? Some people misinterpret the Ramchal to say that. That means you really only have freedom where two options attract you more or less evenly. Because if one option attracts you much more strongly than the other one, obviously you move in the direction of the stronger attraction. That is a denial of free will. What he means is that you could follow either one equally. That means no matter how strong the attractions are, you are free to go either way. But it does not mean that the attractions are equal. In other words, to support the notion of free will, you have to say that I can be caught in a dilemma where one option appeals to me very powerfully and one option appeals to me very weakly, and I can choose the weaker option. Can you see that it has to be like that? It sounds bizarre, doesn't it? Imagine I find myself in an ordeal. The one side speaks to me with massive attraction, tremendous attraction, almost irresistible attraction. And the other option speaks to me very weakly. If you say that I always move in the direction of the stronger attraction, you're denying free will. You're saying that, basically you're saying our mechanical system. There's a metal object here, there are two magnets there. This magnet is stronger, this magnet is weaker. The metal object moves towards the stronger magnet. Or you put a plant in the middle and two lights on either side, the plant moves towards the brighter light. That's a mechanical system. If you say that I function that way, that I have an ordeal on this side and an option on that side, and whatever I do you interpret as being following the stronger option, you're denying my free will. So weird and paradoxical though it sounds, you have to say that I can be faced with two options, one strong and one weak, and I can follow the weaker option. Before we understand how it works, can you see that that must be so? First of all, can I prove to you that it's true? Now, you have to think very carefully, because if you're very skeptical, and if you haven't developed the flexibility of mind to be able to see beyond the way you normally think, whatever I'm going to show you, you'll respond with by saying, oh, that must have been the stronger option. So be careful not to do that, okay? And I don't know what's going to work for you. I'll tell you examples that work for me. But in your own inner being, you have to build an option that appeals to you. Right? Let's take, for example, a person trying to give up smoking. This may not work for you, this example, but let's try. Here's a person who takes a cigarette, and he grapples with two options, okay? The one option is, I'm going to throw away that cigarette and be healthy. I'm talking about a person who's not talking a person who rationalizes. You know, many people blind themselves to the truth, right? I can tell you as a doctor. Many people wake up, smokers who wake up in the morning and cough a pool of blood on the floor and say, I must start smoking filters. No? I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about an individual. I'm talking about an individual who knows exactly what the facts are, not somebody who's denying and rationalizing. There are people like that. As it happens, I was taught pathology, as it happens. In the medical school where I studied, I was taught pathology by a national expert in lung disease who was a heavy smoker. This lady taught us post-mortem dissection. Okay? She used to slice a slice of human lung, black and cavitated, put it in your hand and say, Doctor, what's wrong with that? Okay? She died a few years later. As it happens, she died from an alcohol problem, but that's another discussion. The point is that there are people, okay? Now, put yourself in that position for a moment. I stand, I have the cigarette, I say to myself, look, this is another nail in my coffin. So let's throw it away and live. What is the power of that attraction? To live! Any psychologist will tell you that self-preservation, by definition, the strongest. Live, be healthy, normal, breathe. Or, smoke that cigarette. Well, how strong is that attraction? A few seconds of pleasure? During which I will feel like a failure and feel the cold hand of death again? Those are balanced options. But a 10-year-old wouldn't fall for that. Again, let's get it clear. The one attraction is the attraction of life. The other is 5 seconds of infantile, pathetic, puerile, nothing. Those stack up. Now be careful. Don't say, well, the cigarette must have been a strong attraction. Let's try and bring it a little closer to home. Let's say you're dieting, okay? Now, let's assume, again, you have to make your own example. Let's assume you're sitting there and you say to yourself, this diet is very important, and you go through in your mind what it is that you're going to look like and what your future is going to be, and everything depends on this diet. Everything. In front of you is a wedge of chocolate-covered, layered, cream-filled, and you say to yourself, but no idiot would fall for that, you say to yourself. It's ridiculous, I'm not going to do that. You say, what is in it for me with this piece of chocolate cake? Nothing. It's ridiculous. Not only is it a fleeting pleasure, but I'll hate myself, and it's clear, isn't it? And 3.5 minutes later, you're looking at a plate that is not like, but polished, not. What happened? What happened? What happened there? You knew the importance of the one option. It was very clear. And the other thing was so trivial that it's almost ridiculous. Those aren't equal in attraction, are they? You know,